The sun hung over Lincoln County like a copper plate, heating the air until the scent of dry pine and scorched earth became a weight in the lungs. In the center of the dusty plaza stood the San Jose Church, its whitewashed walls reflecting a glare that made the eyes ache. Sheriff Brady sat atop his black stallion, the animal's flanks lathered in white foam that smelled of salt and exhaustion. In his hand, he held a tin of kerosene, the liquid sloshing with a rhythmic, metallic thud. Inside the cool shadows of the sanctuary, Maria knelt by the altar. The air here smelled of old beeswax and the faint, lingering sweetness of dried lavender tucked into the pews. She heard the heavy thud of boots on the porch, a sound that violated the sacred silence. She couldn't find the strength to stand as the heavy oak doors groaned open, revealing the sheriff's silhouette against the blinding noon. Maria's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage of silk and bone. She couldn't move as the sheriff's spurs chimed, a cold, metallic ringing that felt like a nail being driven into the floorboards of her soul. Outside, the heat was a physical wall, but inside, the chill of the stone floor seeped through her cotton skirt, a reminder of the hundreds who had knelt there before her. The smell of the kerosene began to drift through the open doors, a sharp, chemical invasion that strangled the delicate scent of lavender. Brady's shadow stretched long and distorted across the aisle, reaching toward the altar like a dark finger of the devil himself, claiming a territory that had never belonged to the law of man. Beyond the church doors, the plaza was a stage of shimmering heat and suffocating silence. They watched, the blacksmith, the widow, and the storekeeper, their faces pressed against the shadows of their porches, their breaths held as tight as a coiled snake. The texture of the day felt like sandpaper against their skin, rough and abrasive with the coming violence. The slosh of the kerosene against the whitewashed adobe made a sickening wet sound, a dark stain spreading across the foundation like a bruise. Every man in Brady's posse stood with their hands hovering over their holsters, their eyes darting to the rooftops, waiting for the spark that would turn their boredom into a bloodbath. Across the way, Billy leaned against the rough-hewn timber of the livery stable, his thumb tracing the oily, cold grain of his Winchester. The air in the loft was thick with the smell of dry hay and old horse sweat, but he noticed a single, persistent sound above the sheriff's orders, the rhythmic drip of water from a leaking trough nearby. He looked down at his own calloused hands, the skin mapped with scars and the memory of 100 different ways to survive. Near the church's corner, a tiny desert willow sprout fought through the packed clay, its green leaves a defiant miracle in a town built on ash and greed. The temperature was rising, but his blood felt like mountain ice, focused and still. The sheriff struck a match, the tiny scritch of sulfur cutting through the wind like a gunshot. The flame was a minute, dancing orange demon in the glare of the sun, reflecting in Brady's eyes with a hunger that no land deed could ever satisfy. The frontier was a place of hard choices, a line drawn in the dust between those who built and those who burned. Billy adjusted his Stetson, the felt brim rough against his forehead, and looked at the iron lock of the church door, the final barrier of autonomy. He whispered a phrase his mother had once said about the weight of the world, a mantra for the lawless. "Only if you want it to be," he murmured, his voice lost in the sudden, sharp intake of breath as he stepped from the shadows and leveled his rifle at the flickering flame in the sheriff's hand. "Oh, this building houses subversives, Maria," Brady growled, his voice a dry rasp. "If the law can't find 'em, the fire will." Billy sat in the loft of the livery stable across the street, his thumb tracing the cold, oily grain of his Winchester's receiver. The texture of the wood was a comfort against the biting heat. Through a crack in the siding, he watched the deputies begin to splash the kerosene against the church's foundation. The smell of the fuel reached him, sharp and suffocating, drowning out the scent of dry hay. He noticed a small green sprout, a desert willow, growing stubbornly in the shadow of the church's stone base. "Get the torches, boys," the sheriff commanded. They watched. The townspeople peered through cracked shutters, their faces pale with a fear that tasted like iron in their mouths. The church was more than wood and stone. It held the birth records, the marriage deeds, the very autonomy of their history. Billy adjusted his Stetson, the felt stiff with salt. He looked at the iron lock on the church door, a symbol of a sanctuary that was about to be broken. "Is the world always gonna be this way, kid?" A voice whispered from the shadows of the stable. It was Chavez, his eyes wide. Billy stood up, his spurs giving a faint melodic jingle that sounded like a warning. He looked at the horizon, where the heat waves distorted the mountains into shimmering ghosts. He thought of the life he led, always on the edge of the flame. He adjusted his silk neckerchief, the fabric rough against his throat. "Only if you want it to be," Billy replied. The sheriff struck a match. The flame was a tiny orange demon in the sunlight. As Brady leaned down to touch the wood, a single shot rang out, not hitting the man, but shattering the kerosene tin in his hand. The episode ended with the sheriff screaming as the liquid soaked his boots, and Billy stepping into the light of the plaza, his rifle leveled at the lawman's heart. The retreat into the mountains was a journey through a world of vertical stone and biting, crystalline cold. Billy rode deep into the territory where the white man's maps had no names. The air here smelled of crushed juniper and the raw, damp scent of coming snow. He wasn't being chased by the law now. He was being led by the wind. He reached the Apache encampment hidden within the Eye of the Eagle Canyon. The smell of cedar smoke and roasting venison greeted him, a warmth that countered the frost nipping at his ears. Billy dismounted, his legs stiff. He approached the central fire where Chief Nana sat. The chief's skin was like weathered mahogany, the texture of 1,000 summers and winters etched into his brow. The flickering orange light of the central hearth danced across the intricate beadwork of the warrior's regalia, casting long, rhythmic shadows against the canyon's jagged limestone walls. He noticed the way the younger braves handled their rifles, not with the clumsy aggression of the Lincoln County deputies, but with a silent, reverent familiarity, as if the iron were an extension of their own sinews. The air was a complex tapestry of scents, the sharp medicinal tang of burning sage, the rich oil of the roasting meat, and the faint sweet undertone of the lavender bundle still tucked deep within Billy's vest. Chief Nana did not rise, yet his presence filled the space between the cliffs, a mountain of a man whose stillness was more intimidating than any gunfighter's draw. Billy felt the rough, frozen grit of the earth beneath his boots, a tactile reminder that up here, the only law that mattered was written in the stars and the migration of the elk. As Billy took his place by the fire, the temperature seemed to shift from the biting, crystalline chill of the heights to a radiant, pulsing heat that thawed the marrow in his bones. She couldn't have known, but back in the valley, Maria was likely staring at the same moon, her hands still trembling from the sheriff's kerosene-soaked threats. While here, the silence was a shield rather than a shroud. They watched him, the children with wide, curious eyes, and the elders with a piercing, analytical gaze, searching for the little brother they had heard of in the whispers of the wind. The chief reached out with a hand that felt like gnarled oak, his calloused skin brushing against Billy's as he accepted a peace offering of salt. It was a moment of profound autonomy, a crossing of a spiritual frontier where the boundaries of outlaw and hero dissolved into the rising smoke of the cedar. The chief's voice, when it finally broke the silence, carried the cadence of a landslide, heavy, inevitable, and ancient. He spoke of the land not as a series of deeded plots to be fenced and burned, but as a living, breathing entity that remembered every drop of blood spilled in its name. Billy listened, his thumb tracing the smooth, cool surface of the turquoise stone in his pocket, a contrast to the abrasive, rough texture of the wool duster he wore. He thought of the church in the valley, a structure of wood and stone that men tried to own, and compared it to the vast, open cathedral of the canyon that no man could ever truly possess. The transition from the law of the star to the law of the earth felt like a physical shedding of skin, a realization that the sheriff's fire could destroy walls, but it could never touch the spirit of those who knew how to walk with the mountain's breath. By the time the moon reached its zenith, the encampment had settled into a watchful peace, the only sounds being the occasional crackle of the embers and the distant mournful cry of a hunting owl. Billy realized that his journey into the Eye of the Eagle wasn't a flight from justice, but a pursuit of it, a search for a truth that existed before the first surveyor's stake was driven into the red clay. He looked at the chief, whose eyes now held the reflection of the dying fire, and saw a mirror of his own restless autonomy. The choice to return to Lincoln and face the sheriff's torches felt less like a burden and more like a destiny he was finally ready to inhabit. "Only if you want it to be," he murmured to the cold silver light, the phrase now serving as a promise to the saplings in the valley that their roots would be protected by a man who had learned the language of the stones. "Oh, you come with the smell of smoke on your soul, little brother," Nana said, his voice a deep rumble. Billy offered a pouch of fine tobacco and a small carved wooden horse. He didn't speak of the church or the sheriff. Instead, he participated in the test of the silent stone. He was tasked with sitting by a frozen stream for a full night, protecting a small cedar sapling from the weight of the falling snow. The cold was a physical weight, a piercing needle that seeped through his duster and wool vest. They watched. The Apache warriors watched from the darkness of their wickiups, seeing if the kid would break and seek the fire's heat. Billy didn't move. He felt the rough bark of the sapling and used his own hands to brush away the ice. He thought of the church in the valley, a different kind of growth in a different kind of desert. He noticed the way the stars seemed to pulse with the rhythm of his own heartbeat. "Why do you protect a tree that belongs to no one?" a young warrior asked at dawn. "Because it's the only thing that knows how to grow without permission," Billy whispered, his breath a white cloud in the morning air. The chief approached him as the sun touched the canyon rim. He handed Billy a piece of raw turquoise, a stone that represented the blue of the sky and the autonomy of the spirit. It was cool and smooth in his palm, a contrast to the jagged iron of his spurs. Nana spoke of the land not as property to be deeded, but as a mother who could not be owned by a piece of paper or a tin star. Billy rode back down the mountain as the snow turned to a light, misty rain. He felt a new weight in his pocket, the turquoise stone, and a new clarity in his eyes. The sheriff had tried to burn the church to destroy the people's roots, but Billy had learned that roots grow deeper than fire can reach. The episode closed with Billy looking down at the valley, where the first curls of smoke from the town's morning fires rose like ghosts. Lincoln was a town under a shroud of grey ash and silent terror. The sheriff had rebuilt his courage with whiskey, and the order to burn the church had been renewed. The smell of cheap rye and stale tobacco filled the sheriff's office as he sat with his deputies. They laughed about the outlaw who had run to the hills, while the townsfolk huddled in their homes, the scent of fear like copper on their tongues. The thick, suffocating blanket of silence that draped over the town was broken only by the rhythmic, heavy thud of the sheriff's boots as he stepped out onto the boardwalk, the wood groaning under his weight like a living thing in pain. He noticed the way the moonlight caught the crystalline frost on the pump handle, a cold reminder of the winter that was clawing its way down from the peaks Billy had called home. The air outside the office was a sharp, biting contrast to the stuffy warmth of the wood stove, smelling of wood smoke and the lingering, acrid ghost of the kerosene that had already been splashed against the church's whitewashed walls. Behind him, the shadows of his deputies danced against the frosted glass of the windows, their laughter sounding like the dry rattle of a diamondback in the brush, a predatory noise that signaled the end of the town's fragile sanctuary. Across the street, in the pitch-black maw of the livery stable, Billy sat motionless, his fingers tracing the cold, etched scrollwork on the receiver of his Winchester. The air in his lungs was flavored with the dry, sweet scent of mountain lavender he tucked into his vest, a sensory tether to the high country and the peace he had found among the Apache. They watched, the townsfolk, eyes peeping through the slats of boarded-up windows, as a single torch was struck, the flame a violent orange blossom that hissed against the damp night air. The texture of the moment was like a bowstring pulled to the breaking point, a tension so physical it made the hair on the back of Billy's neck stand up against the rough wool of his collar. He didn't reach for his holster yet. Instead, he watched the sheriff lean in to touch the fire to the sacred timber. The man's face twisted into a mask of whiskey-fueled arrogance that ignored the ancient laws of the land. Maria, kneeling inside the darkened nave of the church, felt the sudden terrifying bloom of heat through the floorboards, the smell of burning cedar beginning to replace the familiar comfort of old incense and beeswax. She couldn't find the breath to pray, her throat constricted by a fear that felt like a handful of dry sand. Yet she refused to flee the altar that had held her family's history for 3 generations. The sound of the fire was a low, hungry growl, a predatory beast beginning to feast on the very heart of Lincoln while the law looked on with a grin. The frontier was no longer a place of expansion and hope. It had become a cage of burning wood and iron, where the only thing cheaper than a man's life was the paper he used to claim his soul. Suddenly, a high, clear whistle cut through the roar of the flames, a sound that belonged more to the mountain eagles than to a mortal man. Billy stepped from the shadows of the stable, his silhouette framed by the silver light of the moon, moving with a cadence that was both graceful and terrifyingly final. The temperature in the plaza seemed to drop 10 degrees as he approached the fire, the turquoise stone on his belt glowing with an eerie, reflected light that seemed to mock the sheriff's puny torch. He didn't draw his gun to kill. Instead, he reached for the heavy iron bell rope hanging just outside the porch, his calloused hands gripping the braided hemp with the strength of a man who had decided that some things were simply too holy to burn. "Only if you want it to be," he whispered into the smoke, a promise that the night was about to change from a massacre into a reckoning. Billy entered the town at midnight, his horse's hooves muffled by rags. The air was still, the wind having died down to a faint, mournful whistle through the eaves. He slipped into the church through a side window. Inside it was dark and smelled of damp stone and the lavender Maria had left behind. He found the iron bell rope, its texture rough and braided, like the hands of the pioneers who had hung it. He noticed the sheriff's men approaching with torches. They moved like shadows of vultures. Maria was there again, huddled by the altar, her hands clutching a small wooden cross. She couldn't stop them this time. The sheriff had 10 men, and his heart was a cold cinder. They watched as the first torch was thrown, landing on the dry porch boards. Suddenly, the church bell began to toll. It wasn't a frantic alarm, but a slow, rhythmic, and powerful sound that shook the very foundations of the plaza. Clang, clang, clang. It was the sound of an ancient heart beating. The sheriff's men froze, the flickering light of their torches reflecting the sudden irrational fear in their eyes. The heavy, low-frequency vibrations of the bell rippled through the stagnant midnight air, turning the dry timber of the church into a giant resonator that Billy could feel deep within his own chest. He noticed the way the sheriff's men, hardened killers who usually laughed at the face of death, began to step back, their boots scuffing tentatively against the dirt as the rhythmic iron tolling seemed to mock their petty torches. The smell of the kerosene-soaked wood on the porch began to rise, a chemical bite that fought against the holy, lingering scent of Maria's lavender, yet the flames seemed to hesitate, flickering low, as if cowed by the sheer authority of the sound. Billy's hands, rough and calloused from years of gripping reins and triggers, pulled the braided hemp rope with a steady, almost surgical precision, his eyes fixed on the shifting orange light that danced across the stone floor of the nave. Maria remained frozen by the altar, the texture of the small wooden cross in her hands feeling like a jagged piece of the earth itself amidst the encroaching heat. She couldn't comprehend the source of the music, for to her ears, the bell wasn't just a warning. It was a defiant voice speaking for the generations of pioneers whose names were inked in the parish records, now resting just inches from the heat. They watched, the deputies and the few townsfolk who dared to peek from their windows, as a thin veil of smoke began to curl under the heavy oak doors, illuminated by the rhythmic flash of the bell's song. The sheriff's face, usually a mask of cold, bureaucratic indifference, twisted into a grimace of pure, unadulterated superstition, his hand trembling as he reached for the silver star on his chest, as if it could protect him from the supernatural weight of the kid's intervention. The heat began to crawl up the inner walls, the temperature in the loft rising until the sweat on Billy's brow felt like ice in the searing draught. Through the rising haze, the silhouette of the kid appeared in the high-arched window of the bell tower, a dark guardian framed by a halo of gold and ember. He stopped pulling the rope for a fleeting second, letting the final clang echo out toward the distant dark mesas, and in that sudden vacuum of sound, the only thing heard was the terrifyingly calm click-click-click of a Winchester being cocked. The iron lock on the main doors, a symbol of the town's communal sanctuary, glowed red in the firelight, and for a heartbeat, the frontier seemed to hold its breath, caught between the holiness of the sanctuary and the hell of the gunfight. Billy looked down at the sheriff, his voice cutting through the roar of the fire with a clarity that ignored the chaos. "Only if you want it to be," he muttered, repeating the phrase like a grim benediction before he began his descent into the very heart of the inferno to save the town's history. He felt the biting cold of the turquoise stone in his pocket, a grounding force against the blistering heat of the burning pews, and he realized that the choice to be a monster or a savior was a border he crossed every single night. The sheriff fired a desperate shot at the tower, the bullet thudding harmlessly into the ancient cedar, but the act only solidified the kid's resolve as he stepped into the smoke, a ghost of the frontier walking through a furnace to prove that the law of the star was no match for the law of the soul. Billy didn't come out shooting. Instead, he climbed to the very top of the bell tower. From the heights, he began to sing a Spanish hymn Maria often sang, a high, clear melody that floated over the crackle of the growing fire. It was the unexpected act. The sheriff looked up, his face twisted in a mix of rage and superstitious dread. He had expected an ambush, a gunfight, a curse, not a prayer. "Shoot him down!" Brady screamed, but his men hesitated. The music seemed to lace through the smoke, creating a border they were afraid to cross. Billy looked down from the tower, the fire beginning to lick at the stairs below him. He felt the heat rising, a searing wave that made his skin prickle. He gripped the turquoise stone in one hand and his Winchester in the other. He wasn't trapped. He was the center of the storm. The episode ended with the bell still tolling and Billy disappearing into the smoke of the loft as the roof began to groan. The church was a skeleton of glowing embers and thick black smoke that smelled of incense and burning cedar. The sheriff stood in the plaza, his Colt 45 drawn, waiting for the kid to burn or jump. The heat was so intense, it forced the deputies back, their faces red and slick with sweat. The sound of the fire was a roar, a hungry beast devouring the history of Lincoln. Then the unexpected happened. Billy didn't jump from the tower. He walked out of the front doors, which were engulfed in flames. He carried something in his arms, not his rifle, but the heavy, iron-bound record book of the parish, the document of every birth and death the town had ever known. His duster was smoking, his face blackened by soot, but his eyes were like blue ice. He noticed the sheriff's hand shaking. Brady wasn't looking at the man, he was looking at the book, the autonomy of the people he had tried to erase. Billy set the book at Maria's feet. She reached out and touched the charred leather, her tears carving tracks through the ash on her cheeks. "The law says this book is ashes, kid," the sheriff spat, trying to regain his stance. "The law is a liar, Pat," Billy replied, his voice calm amidst the roar of the fire. The duel happened in a heartbeat. The sheriff went for his gun, his movement hindered by his own greed and fear. Billy was a blur of motion. 3 shots echoed through the plaza, sharp and final. The sheriff's gun flew from his hand, and his hat was spun from his head. Billy didn't kill him. He shot the sheriff's badge right off his chest, the tin star shattering against the stone well. They watched. The townspeople emerged from the shadows, their silence a powerful judgment. The sheriff stood there, stripped of his authority, a man without a star in a town that had found its soul. Billy looked at the charred ruins of the church, and then at the small desert willow sprout he had seen before. It was scorched, but its roots were deep in the cool earth. Billy mounted his horse, his movement slow and weary. He looked at Maria, then at the horizon where the sun was beginning to rise, a pale, hopeful grey. He felt the cold iron of his Winchester and the warm smoothness of the turquoise stone. He had saved the records, the identity of the people, and in doing so, he had redefined justice on the frontier. "Is it over, William?" Maria asked, her voice a soft whisper. Billy looked at the rising sun, the light reflecting in his tired, youthful eyes. He thought of the mountains, the Apache, and the church that would be rebuilt from these very ashes. He adjusted his hat and turned his horse toward the open desert, a ghost of the frontier. "Only if you want it to be," Billy said, and then he spurred his horse, disappearing into the golden haze of the morning, leaving behind a town that would never forget the boy who sang in the fire.